Well, just a short while ago, I spoke with Cedric Leighton. He is a risk management expert and founder of Cedric Leighton Associates. And I asked him about the U.S. military shift towards Africa. And I began by asking him just how serious a threat Islamists in countries such as Mali really pose.
Well, right now it's an indirect threat, but it is a serious threat because that part of Africa is very resource rich. And in some cases, the resources have not been tapped yet. For example, in Mali itself, there's uranium that's available, but it has not been exploited to any great extent commercially. So the United States and its Western allies have an interest in that part of the world because of the resources and also because that part of northwestern Africa is a jumping off point for everything in Western Europe. Right now, there is a drug trade that goes through Western Africa into Europe, and from Europe, it then goes to the United States or spreads eastward into Eastern Europe or into parts of Asia. So there are so many different factors that are involved here. So there's a criminal element, a resources element, an economic element that's related to the resourcing element, and of course a military piece because of all the others.
You know, looking at this globally, there was a piece in the Washington Post earlier this week which described the dangers for the United States with these groups in North Africa. In fact, the headline in the Washington Post said, "The Asia pivot, which has been the focus of U.S. foreign policy to some extent under President Obama, has become the shift to Africa." And I was just wondering, does this mean that the U.S. has to move some of its military resources from Asia to North Africa, or is this perhaps a little bit of hyperbole in there?
I think there's some hyperbole in there, and the reason I think that is because when you look at the relative numbers in the article itself, it talks about 28,000 troops being stationed in South Korea alone. Other troops are, of course, arrayed in Japan, on Guam, and they're now going into Australia. So there are certain areas where the U.S. either has bilateral defense relationships with Asian nations or defense treaties, mutual defense treaties with those nations. None of that is going to go away. If there is a reapportionment of resources within the U.S. military, it will probably come from CONUS-based, in other words, continental United States-based forces, and forces that are currently in Europe or currently in Afghanistan. Because of the Afghan drawdown, a lot of those forces could, in theory at least, be pivoted to Africa. But it is not going to happen overnight, and it certainly won't happen in the magnitude or to the degree that we see in Afghanistan right now, or to the degree that we already have in Asia.
Right, so the U.S. plan is still to base 50% of its forces in the Pacific and 50% in the Atlantic?
Basically, yes. The strategy that President Obama outlined last year when it came to the pivot to Asia is designed to provide a clear differentiation between the Atlantic side and the Pacific side and basically equalize the balance of forces. It's a recognition that the world has changed. It's a recognition that Europe, while still very important, is not going to be the scene of major economic confrontation between, say, the United States and the European community, the European Union. But Asia is a different story. The relationship between China and the United States is, of course, one that focuses attention on economic issues, on resource issues for both countries, and availability of all of that. And that becomes the major reason for the defense forces to be arrayed the way that they are.
Okay, Colonel Leighton, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.